King Charles watched the woman he spent decades defending get escorted out of Clarence House with 2 days' notice. And the reason behind it was nothing anyone could have predicted. We are not talking about a troubled marriage, quiet tensions building behind closed doors, or some gradual unraveling. We are talking about secret bank accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands that nobody inside the palace had any idea existed until a routine financial audit stumbled across them. The fallout moved so fast and hit so hard that even those working inside the institution are still piecing together exactly what happened and how it was allowed to go on for so long. If you are new to Crown Watch, subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. This investigation is still unfolding and the developments keep coming. The official palace statement landed at 6:47 in the morning on December 3rd. Not a carefully worded release with diplomatic cushioning. Not the kind of language that requires interpretation to understand. It was direct. Buckingham Palace announced that the king had formally requested parliamentary action concerning the titles and status of Camilla Parker Bowles, referring to her by her pre-marriage surname, which was itself the first signal that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The statement confirmed that serious financial irregularities had been uncovered, that undisclosed accounts had been found, and that continuing to hold the title of Queen Consort was no longer tenable. That is not a separation announcement. That is an institutional severance. And the fact that they released it before most people had made their morning coffee tells you everything about how urgently the palace wanted the information out. No calibrated news cycle timing. No lengthy communications review. Just get it into the public domain immediately. What makes this genuinely unlike anything in recent royal history is the speed at which it all moved. Financial misconduct within any major institution, and especially within the monarchy, tends to follow a slow and carefully managed path. Investigations happen quietly. Legal teams build consensus. Communications advisors draft and redraft statements until the damage has been pre-calculated and pre-contained. By the time the public hears anything, the institution has usually built walls around the worst of it. None of that happened here. From the moment Charles learned about these accounts, to the moment Camilla was legally stripped of every title she had spent 2 decades accumulating, 5 days passed. 5 days is not institutional caution. 5 days is either evidence so overwhelming that delay became impossible, or personal fury so complete that it overrode every instinct toward slow and careful management. From what has since come to light, it appears to have been both at once. The whole chain of events began with something genuinely unremarkable. In May 2025, Parliament passed legislation introducing enhanced financial transparency requirements for senior royals who receive public funding. This was not designed to target any specific individual. It was the kind of modernizing governance measure that comes around periodically, driven by public pressure for accountability, independent audits, full asset disclosure, quarterly reporting of significant transactions. Standard oversight that any publicly funded institution arguably should have had in place long before. The firm engaged to carry out the review was Reynolds Partners. They began with the most senior figures, starting with the king himself, and then moving to the Queen Consort's office. On paper, Camilla's finances were expected to be entirely uninteresting. An allowance drawn from the Duchy of Lancaster, some personal wealth from the settlement following her first marriage, household expenses properly recorded and filed. Nobody walked into that review expecting to find anything worth flagging, but an auditor named Sarah Mitchell noticed something unusual in October while working through payment authorization records. There were regular monthly payments going to what looked like a financial management firm registered in Luxembourg. The amounts were not enormous, roughly £5,000 per month, but they were not properly categorized within the palace accounting system. When Mitchell asked for documentation explaining them, the responses that came back were vague. Descriptions referencing estate management services, nothing specific enough to satisfy standard audit requirements. Anyone who has spent time working in auditing or compliance will tell you that vague answers to direct questions are not reassuring. They are a signal. Mitchell followed protocol and contacted the Luxembourg firm directly. What she found was that it was not managing any estate connected to Camilla. It was a shell company whose apparent function was to receive money from various sources and distribute it into accounts held in Camilla's name across multiple jurisdictions. The shell company itself was owned by another corporate entity registered in the British Virgin Islands, creating precisely the kind of layered obscurity that is not an accident. That architecture is built deliberately, and it is built for concealment. Once Mitchell escalated the matter to her senior partners, and the palace became involved, forensic accountants moved in, and the full picture began to emerge quickly. 3 separate accounts at banks in Geneva and Zurich, opened between 2003 and 2005, held combined balances of approximately £3.2 million. Transaction records showed regular deposits arriving from various sources, some based in the UK, others routed through jurisdictions that made clear tracing difficult. Withdrawals were minimal, which suggested the accounts were functioning primarily as vehicles for accumulation rather than spending. Then there were the Cayman Islands accounts opened in 2007, shortly after Camilla's marriage to Charles, holding over £4 million. The apparent sources were primarily UK-based transfers that had been routed through intermediate accounts to obscure their origin. The detail that made the timeline particularly damaging was this: deposits had continued regularly through 2024. These were not old accounts from a previous life that had simply been forgotten. They were live, active, and receiving money throughout Camilla's entire period as Duchess of Cornwall, and then as Queen Consort. This was not passive oversight. This was ongoing concealment. A third cluster of accounts in Luxembourg, holding approximately £1.3 million, appeared to function as a collection point for smaller payments that were then funneled toward the Swiss and Cayman accounts. The structure pointed to sophisticated planning. Someone had spent time working out how to move money in ways that would resist scrutiny. That kind of arrangement does not come together by accident, and it does not reflect someone who simply never got around to disclosing some old family savings. When investigators turned to tracing the actual origins of the money, the patterns became troubling. Some of it appeared to come from wealthy individuals with links to Prince Andrew's social circle, including figures who had previously been associated with entities under investigation for financial misconduct. Other deposits connected to companies operating in sectors where a royal relationship might carry commercial value. No one has proven any direct arrangement involving payment for access, but the timing of certain deposits relative to events Camilla had hosted or causes she had publicly championed created patterns that investigators could not dismiss. Then came the Andrew dimension, which made an already serious situation considerably messier. The timing of specific deposits into Camilla's accounts aligned with periods when Andrew was known to be seeking funds to address legal costs and settlement obligations. No direct transfers between Andrew and Camilla were proven, but the circumstantial patterns raised the possibility of coordination or a shared financial strategy. Coincidences have a way of losing credibility when enough of them stack up in the same direction. Princess Anne was brought into the investigation in mid-November once palace officials understood that the scope of the problem extended beyond simple, undisclosed assets into territory that could carry criminal implications. According to those briefed on the matter, Anne's reaction was one of genuine horror. She is reported to have said that these were not just hidden accounts. They were a structure deliberately built to conceal ongoing financial activity from family members, from palace officials, and from authorities. That level of planning, she observed, was not consistent with innocent omission. It suggested awareness of wrongdoing. Anne's involvement proved pivotal. Her initial inclination was toward discretion, as it generally is within the royal family. But as the investigation deepened, and the nature of the concealment and some of its potential sources became clearer, she concluded that the institution could only be protected through transparency, even if that transparency came at the cost of Charles' marriage and Camilla's position. Sometimes, the act of protecting an institution requires the kind of decision that destroys everything close to it. William was briefed on November 25th, 3 days before his father would be told the full truth. Palace legal counsel walked him through the account structures, the timeline, the amounts, and the potential implications of each. His immediate concern was whether Charles himself might be drawn into the investigation, whether there existed any possibility that the king had known about the accounts and had failed to disclose them. The investigation found no evidence of that, but William understood that the question would be raised publicly regardless of what the evidence showed. Managing that perception was going to be almost as complicated as managing the underlying scandal. Charles was informed on November the 28th. Those who were present described it as one of the most difficult briefings of his reign. Senior advisors laid out documentation covering the accounts, the balances, the timeline of their creation, and the sources of funding that investigators had found troubling. Charles' initial response was disbelief. He kept returning to the idea that there must be innocent explanations, that there were administrative errors or misunderstandings somewhere in the chain. But as he went through the documentation, the possibility of innocent explanation grew smaller and smaller. He told advisors that she had been hiding millions from him for their entire marriage, that while he had been out there defending her publicly, supporting her rehabilitation, vouching for her character to the country, she had been concealing wealth he did not know existed. The question was devastating in its simplicity, and the people who heard it said the room went very still. The confrontation took place that same evening at Clarence House. Charles dismissed his private secretary and his other close aides. Only the protection officers required by protocol remained within reach. When Camilla entered the study at 7:15 in the evening, she understood something was wrong, but not yet the full weight of what was waiting for her. Charles was seated behind his desk rather than in the informal area where they usually talked. The desk between them was not just furniture, it was distance. He had laid out the financial documentation in front of him. Bank statements, account opening records, transaction histories, corporate structures, all printed and arranged chronologically. He did not speak at first. He gestured for her to look. The silence, he later told William, was because even at that moment he was still hoping she would say something that made sense of it. He had not given up on there being an explanation. Her initial response was denial, not of the accounts themselves, but of any wrongdoing. She framed them as old accounts, family money kept separate, nothing requiring formal disclosure. But as Charles pressed further, pointing to transaction records clearly dated throughout their marriage and into her time as queen consort, her confidence in that position began to erode. The denials became less firm. The tone shifted from assertion to defense. The moment things changed was when Charles confronted her with what investigators had found about the connections to individuals in Andrew's orbit, and the timing that suggested possible coordination during Andrew's financial difficulties. He asked her directly what she had been involved in, because what he was looking at did not resemble private savings. It looked like the movement and receipt of money in ways designed to avoid detection. At that point, Camilla's composure broke. She insisted she had been trying to protect the family, that Andrew had come to her years ago in genuine distress, desperate for help navigating financial problems that, if brought to Charles directly, would have forced the king to choose between his brother and his institutional obligations. The accounts, she said, had been structured at Andrew's suggestion as a way to receive and hold funds without connecting them directly to him, channeling them through her before they could be applied to his debts or legal costs. If that account is true, it places Camilla at the center of a financial scheme designed to help Andrew evade accountability for obligations he could not openly address. If it is not true, it is an attempt to shift blame onto the family member whose credibility had already been most thoroughly destroyed. Either way, it confirmed what Charles most feared. The person he had trusted completely had been engaged in financial arrangements deliberately concealed from him, and those arrangements were bound up with a family member whose scandals had done more damage to the monarchy than almost anything else in recent decades. Charles asked the question that mattered most to him, not as king, but as a husband. Had she entered their marriage with these accounts already in place, already hiding this from him? Her answer, halting and qualified, amounted to yes. Some of the accounts had predated the marriage, others had been opened afterward, but she had never disclosed any of them because she had known he would have insisted on either closing them or declaring them, and she had felt a loyalty to Andrew that she could not act on through any channel Charles could officially support. That justification appears to have made things worse rather than better. Charles told her she had made him complicit in her deception. Every public statement he had made supporting her. Every time he had asked the British public to extend trust and acceptance to her. Every year of standing beside her while she rebuilt her reputation. He had been doing all of that while vouching for someone who was withholding fundamental truths from him about her own financial life. He asked her whether she understood what she had done to his credibility and to the institution he served. Camilla tried to argue proportionality. The amounts, she said, were not enormous by the standards of royal wealth. No public money was involved. She had never used her position to enrich herself only to help family. Charles cut through each of these points with what those later briefed on the conversation described as complete precision. The amount is not what matters, he told her. Whether public funds were involved is not what matters. What matters is that you concealed millions in assets, that some of the money appears to come from sources that raise serious questions, and that you lied to me about it for years. This is not a private family matter. This is institutional liability. The conversation deteriorated over the course of 3 hours into recriminations and exchanges so heated that palace staff in adjacent rooms could hear the voices without being able to make out the words. When Camilla left the study, those on duty reported she looked completely undone. She went directly to her private apartments without speaking to anyone. Charles called for his private secretary and legal counsel immediately. His instructions were precise and left no room for negotiation. He wanted a full legal analysis of what would be required to remove her titles. He wanted her out of Clarence House within 48 hours, and he wanted a statement prepared for public release. When advisors suggested that perhaps the process should move more slowly, that additional time for investigation might be warranted before irreversible steps were taken, Charles would not move. She had admitted to substantial concealment of accounts with connections to Andrew's problems. That, he said, was enough. The Crown could not be left implicated in whatever financial scheme she had been part of. William was summoned to Clarence House at midnight. He found his father devastated, but certain. Charles explained that this was not an emotional reaction, despite how it might appear from the outside. What Camilla had done had created real, institutional liability through deliberate deception, and as king, he had no choice but to act on that, regardless of what it cost him personally. William agreed that action was necessary, but pressed for more time to allow proper legal process to run. Charles refused. Every day, she remained queen consort, while they sat on knowledge of this concealment, was another day of institutional dishonesty. It ends now, he said. The legal mechanism for removing Camilla's titles turned out to be considerably more complicated than the urgency demanded. Stripping a queen consort of titles is not like ending a private relationship. It required parliamentary action, Privy Council involvement, and navigation of constitutional precedent that had almost never been tested. The palace legal team worked through the night of November 28th, researching historical parallels. The removal of titles from German-born relatives during the First World War was the closest comparison available, but that had involved foreign royals under wartime pressures, not a sitting queen consort. The 1936 abdication crisis involved voluntary departure, not forced removal. What Charles was asking for had no direct modern precedent. The legal team concluded that several steps were needed. The king would need to formally request parliamentary action through the Home Secretary. The Privy Council would need to advise on whether such action was constitutionally appropriate. Parliament would likely need to pass specific legislation authorizing removal of the titles granted through letters patent at the time of Charles and Camilla's marriage. Under normal circumstances, this could take weeks or months. Charles instructed his legal team to invoke emergency procedures to make clear to parliamentary officials that speed was essential and to use every available mechanism to accelerate the process. His position was that allowing Camilla to continue holding the queen consort title while investigations were ongoing would make the crown complicit in whatever the accounts represented. An emergency Privy Council session was convened on November 30th at Buckingham Palace. The assembled body of senior ministers, judges, and royal advisors heard Palace Council present the evidence, the undisclosed accounts, the amounts, the troubling origin of some of the money, and Camilla's own admission of deliberate concealment. The legal argument put forward was direct. Continuation of the queen consort title under these circumstances created institutional liability and undermined the public trust in the monarchy's financial probity. Removal of titles was a proportionate response to a serious breach of trust with implications for the crown's reputation. The Privy Council deliberated for hours. Several members raised concerns about the precedent being established and about what it meant for a king to effectively remove his wife's titles through institutional rather than personal mechanisms. But the constitutional weight of the king's position ultimately prevailed. The council advised that parliamentary action to remove the titles would be constitutionally appropriate given the circumstances presented. Simultaneously, the government was briefed and moved with uncommon speed. After consultation between the prime minister, senior ministers, and the leader of the opposition, the decision was made to introduce emergency legislation. The bill, drafted overnight and introduced to Parliament on December 1st, was concise and specific. It authorized removal of the titles of Queen Consort, Duchess of Cornwall, and all associated styles granted to Camilla Parker Bowles upon her marriage to the then Prince of Wales, on the grounds that serious financial irregularities had been discovered that made continuation of those titles damaging to the crown. Parliamentary debate was abbreviated given the emergency classification, but the discussion that did take place revealed real division. Some members argued this was proportionate accountability for someone who had held a public position while concealing substantial, undisclosed wealth. Others called it disproportionate, arguing that financial irregularities could be addressed through legal channels without dismantling a person's entire institutional standing. A number raised the question of whether parliamentary power was being used to resolve what was at its heart a personal betrayal. The vote passed with a clear majority. Royal assent followed immediately, with Charles signing away his wife's titles in what those observing described as the most painful constitutional act of his reign. His personal statement, released alongside the parliamentary action, was brief. He described his profound sadness in requesting parliamentary action concerning titles held by Camilla Parker Bowles. The discovery of serious financial irregularities and substantial undisclosed accounts had made continuation of the Queen Consort title untenable. The action had been taken to protect the integrity of the crown, not from personal vindictiveness, but from institutional necessity. He asked for privacy as he navigated a decision that was personally devastating, even as it was constitutionally required. Camilla's response came through her lawyers rather than any personal statement. It challenged the characterization of the accounts as misconduct and reserved all legal rights to contest the title removal. But legally, once Parliament had acted and the king had signed, the matter was settled. Camilla Parker Bowles was no longer queen consort, no longer duchess, no longer anything but a private citizen whose marriage to the king remained technically intact while being destroyed in every sense that actually mattered. Public reaction split along fault lines that revealed genuine divisions in British society. Older citizens, many of whom remembered the Diana years and had watched Camilla's long and difficult rehabilitation unfold over decades, expressed complicated and often painful sympathy. Many felt Charles had moved too harshly, that financial irregularities, however serious, did not warrant complete erasure of a person who had finally, after years of effort, earned a measure of public acceptance. Online discussions filled with arguments that she was being made a scapegoat, that the punishment bore no relation to the offense. Younger demographics, particularly those for whom institutional accountability carried real weight, were more likely to support the action. Hidden millions struck them as a fundamental betrayal, made worse by the monarchy's reliance on public funding and by the recent push for financial transparency that the legislation had embodied. The fact that Camilla had been accumulating undisclosed wealth through a period of significant national economic hardship created a particular kind of anger that personal sympathy could not easily reach. International reaction tracked the same divisions. American coverage, which had never quite reconciled with Camilla given the Diana narrative that still shaped so much of that market's perception, treated the scandal as a confirmation of long-held doubts about her character. European outlets, more accustomed to the financial complexities of royal institutions, covered it as serious but not entirely without precedent. Commonwealth nations watched carefully, aware that instability at the center of the monarchy could carry ripple effects for their own constitutional arrangements. The financial investigation did not slow down once the title removal became public. If anything, it intensified as the publicity brought new information forward. Several British businessmen disclosed that they had made payments to entities connected to Camilla's accounts, describing them as charitable contributions or consultancy fees, though investigators suspected the descriptions were not complete. Analysis of the timing of certain deposits against royal events and calendar records showed that significant payments had arrived in the accounts within weeks of events Camilla had hosted, or following her public advocacy for causes connected to specific industries. No direct arrangement could be proven, but the pattern was enough to sustain serious concern. Camilla's children from her first marriage, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, mounted a public defense of their mother. In a joint statement, they argued she had been trying to help Prince Andrew navigate financial situations that were genuinely impossible, that her decision to conceal the accounts had been motivated by a desire to protect Charles from having to know about or participate in difficult family bailouts, and that she had never at any point used her position for personal financial gain. The defense was plainly heartfelt. It was also undermined by the nature of what had been found. Shell companies in Luxembourg and accounts in the Cayman Islands are not the financial architecture of a family favor. That level of structure belongs to something more deliberately designed. For Charles personally, the aftermath reached into parts of his life that no public statement could address. He had spent the better part of 50 years loving Camilla. He had endured enormous public hostility to be with her and had spent years working to bring public and institutional opinion around to accepting her. To discover that throughout their marriage she had been concealing financial arrangements connected to the family member whose behavior had done the most to weaken the monarchy was not just a legal problem. It was a question about whether he had ever truly known the person he had built his personal life around. People close to Charles noted that he aged visibly in the days following the title removal, moving through his duties with mechanical reliability, but without the quality of genuine engagement that had always characterized him. He moved out of Clarence House himself. He could not remain there. He relocated to Buckingham Palace apartments he had previously avoided for being too cold and too formal. William found his own position genuinely difficult to navigate. He needed to support his father while managing the expansion of his own responsibilities as heir apparent. He issued a public statement supporting Charles's decision as institutionally necessary. Privately, he wrestled with what the episode implied. If a king could use parliamentary mechanisms to remove a queen consort's titles over financial misconduct, however serious, what did that establish about the permanence of any position in the institution? What did it say about the security of titles earned through years of service? Catherine found herself in a role that arrived faster than anyone had planned for. With Camilla gone from the institution, she became the senior female royal, absorbing patronages and duties she had expected to have more time to prepare for. People close to her described her as meeting the moment with composure while privately carrying real concern for what the scandal was doing to Charles and to the wider institution. The constitutional questions that the episode raised were not going to resolve quickly. Parliament had acted to remove a queen consort's titles at the king's formal request regarding his own wife. Whatever the justification, the mechanism created a precedent where the monarch could use parliamentary power to address a personal betrayal by framing it in institutional terms. Constitutional scholars began asking whether this represented appropriate cooperation between Crown and Parliament, or something that could be misused in ways that had not yet been thought through. There were also questions about what Charles had known and when. Investigators found no evidence he had been aware of the hidden accounts before November 2025. But some commentators observed that it was difficult to understand how financial concealment on this scale could have been maintained for 2 decades without any signal reaching him at all. The question of whether he might have chosen not to look too closely at things that might have been uncomfortable lingered at the edge of the public conversation, never quite going away. As December continued, the story found no natural resting point. New details surfaced regularly, each one either adding weight to the case that what Camilla had done was calculated and serious, or reinforcing the view that the response had been disproportionate and that a king had weaponized institutional power against someone whose offense, however real, did not merit complete destruction. The answer to that question depended on what one believed the monarchy was for and what it owed the people it asked to trust it. What had become clear was that Charles had made a defining choice, one that would follow his reign regardless of how history eventually judged it. He chose institutional integrity over personal loyalty. He chose transparency at devastating personal cost over the kind of quiet management that royal families have historically preferred. Whether that choice is ultimately seen as a mark of strength or a failure of mercy, of wisdom, or of cold institutional calculation remained genuinely unresolved. For Charles himself, sitting alone in palace apartments while the woman he had spent his life defending lived under a legal cloud somewhere else, the personal cost of that choice needed no future verdict. It was already present and already complete. What this whole situation reveals is the impossible weight of being both husband and king at the same time, of loving someone deeply while serving an institution that cannot accommodate deception inside its walls. Charles faced something no public role manual prepares a person for: the choice between protecting the woman he had spent 50 years beside or protecting the crown he had waited a lifetime to serve. He chose the institution. That choice will be part of his story long after the details of the accounts and the legal proceedings have faded. For Camilla, the tragedy has a particular completeness to it. She spent years rebuilding herself in public, earning acceptance through sustained effort and visible commitment to duty. Whatever drove her to maintain those accounts, whether loyalty to Andrew, a desire to hold something entirely her own, or something more calculated, the revelation erased in 3 days what had taken decades to construct. Her rehabilitation did not survive contact with the truth of what had been hidden underneath it. The accounts were not only money, they were years of sustained omission, a version of herself she chose never to show, and a foundation of concealment on which a very public life had been quietly built. When that foundation was exposed, everything standing on it came down at once. Sometimes love cannot carry the weight of what has been kept from it. Sometimes duty asks for the kind of decision that breaks every other thing you thought was permanent. And sometimes the real cost of living inside an institution that runs on trust is discovering that the person you were most certain of had been all along keeping a different version of the truth.